When I first moved into the neighborhood, I was just looking for a quiet place to settle down. A small house with a tidy lawn, in a cul-de-sac with friendly neighbors and a decent HOA to keep things looking nice, that's all I really wanted. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. The homes were well kept, people waved as they walked their dogs, and the HOA president, Karen, introduced herself within a day of me moving in. She had that signature look, bleach blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, a clipboard in hand like it was part of her anatomy, and the kind of smile that made you feel like she was sizing you up more than welcoming you. Karen was the type of person who thrived on control. She didn't just enforce the HOA rules, she lived for them. Whether it was the precise height of your grass or the color of your mailbox, Karen knew it all and wasn't shy about reminding you if you were even an inch out of compliance. During our first conversation, she handed me a printed list of all the community guidelines, highlighted and annotated. "Just to help you settle in," she said with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I thanked her, more amused than anything. I figured she'd back off when she realized I wasn't the type to stir trouble. I kept my yard neat, followed the trash bin schedule, and didn't throw loud parties. But it turned out none of that mattered. Karen had a need for conflict, and I quickly learned that simply existing outside her control was enough to make me a target. The first warning letter came a week later. According to Karen, I had left my porch light on too late into the night, which was somehow a violation of light pollution guidelines. I laughed it off, assuming it was just Karen being Karen, but then came the second letter, this time about my recycling bin being placed 2 inches outside the designated zone. I began to suspect she was watching my house constantly. The other neighbors sympathized but were clearly intimidated by her. No one wanted to challenge Karen because she had a reputation for retaliating. Then came the accusation that set everything in motion. One morning, as I was watering my front garden, Karen stormed up my driveway, phone in hand, voice sharp and loud. "I've reported you to the police and the HOA board," she barked. "We know what you're doing. You're stealing electricity from the neighborhood. That's a felony, and I have proof." I blinked, dumbfounded. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "We've seen the spike in the HOA's communal utility costs since you moved in. You think you can just tap into our system and no one would notice?" At first, I thought she was bluffing. I laughed, thinking it was just another absurd overreach, until, about 20 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up in front of my house. My heart dropped. Karen stood at the end of the driveway, arms crossed with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed justice was about to be served. The officers were calm, professional. They explained there had been a report of utility theft and that they needed to take a look at the electric meters and the connection to the grid. I invited them in without hesitation. I had nothing to hide, and I wanted this whole thing cleared up fast. But behind my frustration was something deeper, a growing sense that Karen wasn't just obsessed with rules. She was obsessed with power, and for some reason I had become her personal enemy. What I didn't know then was that this false accusation would lead to something far bigger, and it wouldn't be me who ended up exposed. The officers were courteous, but I could tell they were skeptical. Not hostile, just cautious, like they had walked into enough neighbor disputes to know things are rarely as simple as one person claiming another is stealing electricity. I showed them around the outside of the house first, pointing out the electric meter on the side wall, the line from the pole, and the breaker box. Everything was standard, clean, and untouched. No suspicious cables, no loose wires, nothing that would even suggest tampering. Karen stood across the street with her phone raised, no doubt recording everything. She looked almost gleeful, like this was the highlight of her week. Every few minutes, she would shout something unnecessary. Check the back of the house, or ask him where the line runs to. The officers ignored her. One of them gave me a tight smile and muttered, "We get these types." I nodded, silently grateful that at least they weren't buying into her hysteria wholesale. Inside the house, I led them down to the basement where the main panel was. They examined it thoroughly, taking photos, tracing wires, even using a voltage detector on some of the outlets. I could tell they weren't finding anything out of the ordinary. One officer even said, "Looks like your system's running clean. Nothing illegal here." But they had to follow protocol, so they kept going, looking for any signs of unauthorized connections or bypasses. Still nothing. Meanwhile, Karen was pacing the street like a general overseeing a battlefield. A few of the neighbors came out to see what the commotion was. I saw some familiar faces whispering to each other, eyes shifting between my house and Karen. One of them, an older guy named Mike, gave me a sympathetic shrug. He'd lived in the neighborhood for years and had warned me early on that Karen's HOA antics were legendary. "If she's after you," he once said, "expect nonsense." The officer stepped outside again to inspect the power lines and connections from the pole to the house. That's when one of them frowned and pointed out a curious detail, a cable running behind the row of houses that didn't seem to match the usual layout. They radioed for a utility tech to assist with a more in-depth inspection. Karen immediately jumped in, claiming that was probably the line he tapped into. I stayed silent, letting them do their work. The officer, who had been mostly quiet until now, asked me calmly, "Has anyone else had issues with her before?" I raised my eyebrows. "You mean Karen?" "Everyone's had issues with her. But I didn't think she'd go as far as filing a false police report." He nodded like he'd heard that story before. "We'll get to the bottom of it." The utility technician arrived within the hour. A short guy with thick glasses and a no-nonsense attitude. He quickly got to work tracing the electrical paths, testing connections, and examining the shared infrastructure. As he moved further down the property line, his brows started knitting. He began shaking his head and murmuring, "That's odd. This isn't coming from here." He motioned to the officers. "This line that's drawing the extra load. It's not coming from this house. It's coming from 2 doors down, maybe even the other side of the lot." Karen, who had been watching intently, suddenly looked nervous. She stopped recording. One of the officers turned toward her, eyes narrowing slightly, and said, "Ma'am, we'll need to check your property next." Her face drained of color. "My property? That's ridiculous. I'm the one who called you." "Yes," the officer replied calmly, "and we've ruled out his home. But the power discrepancy is real, and the source isn't here. So we need to keep following the line." Karen's lips pursed, and she crossed her arms tightly. For the first time that day, she didn't have a comeback. I stood silently on my lawn, arms folded, watching as the tables began to turn. The technician walked with quiet purpose, tracing the cable that had raised his suspicions. The officers followed close behind, their demeanor now shifting from passive observers to active investigators. Karen trailed behind, loudly insisting that there must be a mistake. "This is harassment," she yelled, waving her clipboard like it had some kind of legal authority. "I demand a warrant before you step foot on my property." The lead officer, a calm but stern woman named Officer Daniels, stopped and turned to face her. "Ma'am, the utility technician has the legal right to inspect shared infrastructure and utility lines that service the neighborhood. If we find probable cause connected to your home, then yes, we may need to ask for access. But at this moment, we're still investigating and will remain on public or easement property." Karen's jaw clenched, but she stepped back. The technician, meanwhile, crouched down at the rear edge of Karen's backyard where a small utility access panel sat hidden behind a row of manicured hedges. He removed the cover and stared inside for a long moment. Then he whistled, low and sharp. "Found something," he muttered. "Definitely not standard." He pulled out his flashlight and aimed it at a bundle of wires spliced together with electrical tape, half buried in the dirt. The bundle led from the utility box directly toward Karen's property. "Someone's tapped into the community power line here," he announced. "This isn't accidental. It's intentional, and whoever did it knew what they were doing. But they didn't do a very good job hiding it." Karen took a step back, her eyes darting. "That's not mine. That must have been from the previous owners or one of the landscapers. I don't know anything about wires." Officer Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, she motioned to her partner, who began snapping photos of the setup. "We'll keep following it," she said, then turned to me. "You've been cooperative and honest. You're free to go inside, but we may need to speak with you again if this continues to unfold." I nodded, still stunned but slightly satisfied. I stayed nearby, pretending to tend to my flowers as I watched the show unfold. The technician began tracing the line into Karen's property. It disappeared beneath a section of wooden fence and reemerged on the other side, coiled sloppily under a decorative rock near the corner of her shed. That shed, painted pristine white with a private property sign screwed to the door, had always seemed a little out of place, overbuilt for gardening with heavy-duty locks and dark-tinted windows. Now it was starting to make sense. Officer Daniels knocked on the shed door. "Ma'am, we need access to this structure." Karen hesitated. "This is outrageous. That's a personal storage space. We have reason to believe it contains illegal wiring connected to utility theft," Daniels said. "You can open it, or we can contact the city for an emergency inspection order." With visible reluctance, Karen dug a jangling set of keys out of her fanny pack and unlocked the shed. The door creaked open, and the truth stood there in plain sight. A large freezer hummed loudly in the corner, several standing fans whirred on high speed, and an array of power strips ran along the wall, all connected to a junction box that definitely didn't look standard. The technician's eyes widened. "There's no meter here," he said. "This isn't drawing power through her home. It's bypassing her main panel entirely." Officer Daniels turned to Karen, her tone suddenly firmer. "You've been illegally tapping into the community's electricity, likely for years. That's utility theft, a serious offense." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. For once, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was speechless. I watched from across the lawn, arms crossed, trying not to smirk. The woman who had tried to frame me was now caught red-handed, and this was only the beginning. The officers moved quickly once the illegal setup was uncovered. Officer Daniels radioed for additional support and requested a city code enforcement officer to document the violations. Karen stood frozen just outside her shed, a forced smile stretched thin across her face. It was the look of someone who had built a kingdom of rules only to be crushed by her own deception. Her voice trembled as she said, "This isn't what it looks like. I didn't do this. Someone must have set me up." No one was buying it anymore. The technician pointed out the wiring configuration to Officer Daniels. "This junction box here is pulling power straight from the community line. No meter, no regulation. Everything inside this shed is powered illegally." He looked at Karen and added, "This didn't happen by accident. Someone wired this deliberately." Karen glanced around as if hoping someone would come to her rescue or back up her story. But the neighbors had gathered silently across the street, watching with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. People who had been victimized by Karen's endless HOA letters and threats were finally seeing justice served. Even Mike, the older Neighbor who had warned me about her stood near the mailbox with his arms folded, shaking his head slowly. Officer Daniels opened her notebook. "Ma'am, we'll need a full statement from you. At this time, I'm advising you that this could lead to criminal charges including theft of utilities and tampering with municipal infrastructure." Karen snapped. "I am the president of this HOA. I know the rules better than anyone. I don't steal." The irony was laughable. I'd been accused of theft just hours earlier, publicly shamed and nearly arrested based on her bogus report, yet now she was standing in front of a shed wired like a mad scientist's experiment, stealing power from the very infrastructure she claimed to protect. It wasn't just hypocrisy. It was arrogance, the belief that she was untouchable. The officers started photographing everything: the tangled wires, the exposed cable that led across the easement, the overloaded power strips, even the massive freezer humming away with an illegal current. One of them carefully lifted a rug on the shed floor, revealing a shallow trench where the wires had been hidden. "She went through a lot of trouble to hide this," he said, shaking his head. City code enforcement arrived shortly after and confirmed multiple violations. The shed itself was built without proper permits, the electrical setup was a fire hazard, and the power tap was an egregious offense. Karen's face went pale when the officer mentioned fines and possible prosecution. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was buzzing. People who had lived in fear of HOA penalties for things as small as mismatched curtains or minor landscaping violations now realized Karen wasn't just strict, she was corrupt. Rumors spread like wildfire. One neighbor whispered that Karen had once fined a family for having a too colorful children's playset. Another said she blocked a neighbor's garage project for months, citing aesthetic disruptions that now seemed petty in comparison to her own crimes. Karen tried to recover her composure. "This is a misunderstanding. I can clear this up with the board." But Officer Daniels was already taping off the shed with bright yellow caution tape. "No, ma'am," she said firmly. "This is going beyond the board. You're being investigated for a criminal offense." Karen's shoulders slumped, and for the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, she looked small, powerless, alone, and it was a sight I knew none of us would forget. As I stood at the edge of my lawn, watching the whole thing unfold, I couldn't help but think how poetic it all was. Karen had tried to take me down with lies, but in the end, it was her own hidden truth that brought her empire crashing down. The next few days in the neighborhood were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Word about Karen's illegal power tap spread like wildfire. By the following morning, it wasn't just the immediate neighbors who knew, it was practically the whole subdivision. People who had once tiptoed around her rules now walked with a new kind of confidence. Karen's reputation as the iron-fisted enforcer of the HOA had crumbled overnight, and the very people she had policed for years were now openly talking about her downfall. I kept to myself for the most part, but I couldn't help overhearing the buzz. Walking to the mailbox, I passed a group of neighbors who had gathered in front of Mike's house. One of them, Mrs. Patel, chuckled. "You remember when she fined me because my tulips were too tall? And she's out here stealing electricity. I had to repaint my fence twice because she didn't like the shade," another man added. "And she was hiding a criminal setup in her backyard the whole time." It was clear the tide had turned. People who had feared Karen's clipboard and threatening letters were now emboldened. Some were even digging up old grievances, looking through HOA meeting notes and emails to see just how far her overreach had gone. One resident discovered that Karen had quietly approved a budget for community beautification, which conveniently funded improvements to the front of her house, new shrubs, new lighting, and even a brand new brick mailbox that was curiously not installed by any registered contractor. The HOA board embarrassed and under scrutiny, had no choice but to act. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time since I moved in, the community clubhouse was packed. Karen was noticeably absent, but her name dominated the discussion. Residents brought evidence of her abuses, photos of nitpicky violations, unexplained fees, and selective enforcement of the rules. Someone even brought a binder of her email threads, highlighting her condescending tone and veiled threats. The board president, a quiet man named Thomas who had long been in Karen's shadow, finally spoke up. We all trusted her to maintain order and represent the community. But it's clear now that Karen misused her authority. The board will conduct a full audit of her actions and expenditures during her time in office. There was a collective sigh of relief, followed by a ripple of applause. People had been waiting for this moment, not just for accountability, but for change. Later that week, a formal notice was sent out via email and posted to every mailbox. Karen had been officially removed from her position on the HOA board pending the outcome of the investigation. In addition, the HOA would no longer enforce any of her previous individual citations until they could be reviewed. As for the legal side, Officer Daniels returned to the neighborhood a few days later to speak with several residents, myself included. She thanked me for my cooperation and confirmed that Karen was facing criminal charges for utility theft and building code violations. When I asked if she thought Karen would be convicted, she said, "We have overwhelming evidence. It's going to be hard for her to talk her way out of this." Despite the drama, I felt a strange sense of peace returning to the neighborhood. For the first time since I moved in, I wasn't worried about whether my recycling bin was a few inches off or if my porch light stayed on too long. The mood around the community had changed. Neighbors smiled more. People chatted longer at the mailbox. We were no longer under surveillance. We were finally just neighbors again. And Karen, once the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, had vanished from sight. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to breathe easier. Without Karen's looming presence, the cul-de-sac felt lighter, almost like the entire community had exhaled a long-held breath. No more surprise citations, no more clipboard walk-bys, no more passive-aggressive notes about mailbox colors or porch furniture. The transformation was immediate and noticeable. People started reclaiming their yards and porches, planting flowers, repainting fences, even decorating with lights, things they had avoided for fear of her disapproval. The HOA board, eager to rebuild trust, announced a community meeting with a fresh agenda. This time, it wasn't about fines or restrictions. It was about restoration, transparency, forgiveness. They opened the floor for residents to speak openly about their experiences under Karen's leadership, and for the first time, people who had stayed silent for years stepped forward. A single mom named Denise spoke first. Karen fined me 3 times in one summer for my son's basketball hoop, even though it was on our own driveway. She said it was an eyesore. I took it down because I couldn't afford the constant penalties. My son stopped playing outside. Her voice cracked and someone handed her a tissue. The board listened, and for once, they truly heard. Others followed. A retired couple had paid over $800 in violation fees for a garden gnome Karen claimed violated the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. A veteran shared that Karen threatened to report him to the city for parking his truck with military decals in front of his own home. The stories spilled out, one after another, each one adding weight to the truth everyone now knew. Karen's reign hadn't been about community standards. It had been about power and control. In the midst of it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say anything more. Everyone knew what had happened, how she had tried to frame me, how the police ended up exposing her instead. My story had become something of a legend, and I didn't need to relive it. The best part was, I didn't have to defend myself anymore. The facts had spoken louder than any rumor ever could. The board wrapped the meeting with a powerful announcement. They were initiating a full policy review. All existing citations issued by Karen would be reevaluated. Any financial penalties deemed excessive or unfair would be refunded. Going forward, a community vote would be required for any new rule. Changes, and no single member would have unchecked authority. It was a new era, one that promised fairness, respect, and actual neighborly values. As for Karen, she had quietly moved out 2 weeks after her shed was shut down and taped off. The property went up for sale soon after, and from what I heard, she was trying to negotiate a deal that wouldn't draw attention to the legal trouble she was facing. But it was too late. Her name was already tied to public court records. The city had filed charges, and the case was moving forward. Last I heard, her attorney was trying to strike a deal to avoid jail time in exchange for full repayment and a hefty fine. It was poetic justice. The woman who once ruled the neighborhood with a smile and a clipboard was now reduced to a cautionary tale. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, weeks after it all ended, Mike stopped by my driveway with a couple of beers. "Well," he said, cracking one open and handing me the other, "you survived, Karen. That officially makes you one of us."